The pre-dawn mist clung to the Colorado River like a burial shroud, muffling the desperate cries that echoed across the water. Clara McKenzie's gold dress with blue trim caught the pale moonlight as she plunged from the low wooden bridge, her bound hands clawing at the air, before the churning current swallowed her whole. The two men who had thrown her watched for a moment, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, before disappearing into the shadows of Cedar Falls. From the riverbank, Kicking Horse froze mid-step. The Comanche warrior had been tracking a wounded deer through the cottonwoods when the woman's scream pierced the night. His weathered hands tightened on his bow as he watched the golden fabric disappear beneath the dark water. Something about this deliberate cruelty awakened memories of his own daughter's final screams. Clara McKenzie, 16 and possessed of the fierce intelligence that made her dangerous to men like Judge Cornelius Wade, had spent her life in the shadow of corruption. Wade commanded Cedar Falls with the absolute authority of a man who viewed every person as either an asset or an obstacle. At 50, his weathered face bore the cold calculation of someone who had built an empire on other people's graves. The McKenzie land held secrets that made it worth killing for. Beneath the modest farm lay silver veins so rich they could fund armies, but Thomas McKenzie had discovered something even more valuable. Evidence that Wade was merely a puppet in a larger conspiracy. Eastern mining syndicates had been systematically stealing territorial resources, using corrupt judges like Wade to clear legal obstacles through murder and fraud. Clara's father had died before he could expose the full scope of the conspiracy, but not before hiding evidence that could destroy men whose names appeared on bank ledgers in New York and Chicago. Wade's desperation to claim the McKenzie land stemmed not just from its silver, but from his terror that Thomas McKenzie's papers would surface and reveal his master's identities. The confrontation that sealed Clara's fate had occurred 3 days earlier in the town square. Wade had cornered her outside Morrison's general store, his breath reeking of whiskey as he leaned close enough for watching townspeople to hear every word. "Miss McKenzie," his voice carried false warmth. "Surely you've reconsidered my generous offer. A young woman in your position needs proper guidance." Clara's hands trembled as she clutched her market basket, but her voice remained steady. "Judge Wade, I've made my position clear. I'm not interested in marriage." Wade's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered in his pale eyes. "Your mother's medical bills continue mounting. Dr. Harrison tells me she owes nearly $60 now. Quite beyond a seamstress's means." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Clara felt the weight of watching eyes, sensing the crowd's mixture of sympathy and fear. "My family's debts are not your concern, Judge Wade." Clara's voice carried farther than intended, drawing more attention. "We'll manage without your assistance." Wade's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the killer beneath. His fingers dug into Clara's arm as he pulled her closer. Every woman needs protection in lawless territory. Tragic accidents happen to those who refuse sensible arrangements. Clara wrenched free, her green eyes blazing with defiance. "Are you threatening me publicly, Judge Wade, before all these witnesses?" The square fell silent except for the whisper of wind through weathered buildings. Wade's reputation for ruthlessness was legendary, but few had seen someone challenge him so directly. Wade straightened his coat with deliberate precision, his politician's smile sliding back into place. "Concerned for your welfare, my dear. Nothing more." He tipped his hat before walking away. But Clara caught the look he exchanged with his companions, Dutch Morrison and Bill Hawkins, killers, whose loyalty could be purchased with whiskey and gold. That night, as Clara tended her mother's fever, Margaret McKenzie gripped her daughter's wrist with surprising strength. "Child, you must be careful. Your father said Wade was like a rabid wolf, charming until he smells weakness, then he goes for the throat." "Wade is all bluster, Mama." Margaret's fevered grip tightened. "Your father didn't think so. The night before he died, Thomas told me Wade had been pressuring landowners. Some had accidents, barn fires, poisoned cattle. Thomas was gathering proof, said it would protect us if anything happened." Clara's blood chilled. What kind of proof? Hidden papers. Thomas discovered our land holds more than silver. It holds evidence that could hang powerful men in distant cities. Then they found him at Devil's Canyon, with his neck broken. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. Thomas McKenzie hadn't died accidentally. He had been murdered for threatening interests that stretched far beyond Cedar Falls. Heavy boots on the front porch ended Clara's deliberation. 3 sharp knocks echoed, followed by Dutch Morrison's gravelly drawl. "Miss McKenzie, Judge Wade requests your presence. Business concerning your mother's care," he says. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Through the window, she could see 2 silhouettes' hands resting on gun butts with practiced casualness. "It's rather late for business, Mr. Morrison. Perhaps tomorrow would be more appropriate." Hawkins's nasally laugh sent ice through Clara's veins. "Judge don't appreciate waiting, girl. Especially after you showed him disrespect today. Open up before we decide to let ourselves in." Splintering wood ended her hesitation. Morrison's shoulder connected with the door frame, sending the latch flying. The killers entered like wolves, claiming territory, eyes adjusting to dim lamplight. "Judge is waiting down by the river." Morrison's scarred face split into a predatory grin. "Got a final offer that'll solve everyone's problems." Clara positioned herself between the men and her mother's bedroom. Understanding that Wade intended to eliminate all witnesses to his conspiracy. "My mother is gravely ill. I cannot leave her." "Don't fret about the old woman." Hawkins pulled rope from his coat. "She won't be alone much longer." The implication struck Clara like a physical blow. "Please take me, but spare her. She knows nothing." Morrison's expression held no mercy. "Should have thought of that before embarrassing the judge in public." Clara submitted to the rope, binding her wrists, feeling hemp bite into flesh, with the casual brutality of men accustomed to violence. As Morrison secured the knots, Hawkins lingered by Margaret McKenzie's bedside. "What are you doing?" Clara's voice rose toward panic. "Cleaning up loose ends." Morrison moved toward the pillow beside Margaret's head. "No." Clara's scream pierced the night. "I'll do anything Wade wants. Marry him, sign papers, anything." The killers exchanged glances, some silent calculation passing between them. Finally, Morrison stepped away from the bed. "Wade's got different plans for you, girl. But the old lady lives for now. You cause trouble and Dutch comes back to finish what we started." They dragged Clara into darkness, while her mother slept on, unaware her daughter was being led to execution. The ride to the Colorado River passed in a blur of dread and calculation. Morrison and Hawkins spoke little, focused on the dark trail winding through cottonwoods toward rushing water. Clara's mind raced through escape scenarios, but bound and flanked by killers, her options remained non-existent. The bridge where they stopped was a crude wooden platform spanning the river's narrowest point, used mainly for cattle drives. In pre-dawn darkness, it looked as fragile as Clara felt. "Judge wanted us to offer one final chance." Morrison dismounted and yanked Clara from her horse. "Sign over your land rights, agree to marriage, and maybe you see sunrise." Clara's bound hands made signing impossible, confirming what she already knew: Wade intended murder, regardless of her answer. "I won't sign anything." Clara's voice carried more strength than she felt. "If you're going to kill me, at least be honest about it." Hawkins backhanded her with casual violence, splitting her lip and sending her stumbling toward the bridge's edge. "Judge tried being nice. You chose the hard way." The river below moved with deceptive laziness, its surface reflecting the quarter moon like black glass. Clara had swum these waters as a child, but never at night, never with bound hands, never while fighting for her life. "Any final words?" Morrison asked with mock formality. Clara straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "Tell Judge Wade that my father's evidence still exists. Killing me won't bury the truth about his Eastern masters. It was pure bluff. She had no idea what evidence Thomas had gathered. But uncertainty flickered in Morrison's eyes. "We'll handle that later." Morrison's hands connected with Clara's back, sending her tumbling over the railing into darkness. The impact drove breath from her lungs in an explosion of pain and bubbles. Current caught her immediately, tumbling her like debris, while her heavy dress wrapped around her legs like chains. Rope, binding her wrists, felt like anchors dragging her toward drowning. Panic fought with determination as Clara forced herself to think clearly. Her father had taught her to swim in this river, emphasizing the importance of remaining calm in dangerous water. The current was strong, but not insurmountable. If she could somehow free her hands or find something to cling to. The fallen log that saved her life appeared from darkness like divine intervention. Clara's desperate fingers found purchase on waterlogged bark just as her strength began failing. The massive trunk, probably torn loose during spring floods, was stable enough to support her weight, while current carried them both downstream. As dawn broke over Texas landscape, Clara clung to her unlikely savior and planned survival. Wade's men would assume the river had claimed her, buying precious time if she could reach shore. Approaching hoofbeats made her heart sink. Wade's killers were following the riverbank, searching for her body to confirm their success. Clara pressed herself flat against the log, using its bulk for concealment, as riders passed overhead. "Don't see hide nor hair of her." Hawkins's voice carried clearly across water. Current probably swept her clear to Mexico by now. "Judge wants proof," Morrison replied grimly. "We keep looking until we find enough pieces to convince him she's fish food." Their voices faded downstream, but Clara knew they would return. Wade was too thorough to accept death on faith alone, especially with so much at stake. The eastern bank offered better cover, thick stands of mesquite and cottonwood that could hide a fugitive from casual observation. Clara began working toward shore, using the log for support, while fighting the relentless current. 20 yards from safety, the log struck a submerged boulder and began disintegrating. Clara had seconds to reach solid ground before losing her only support. She kicked frantically, waterlogged dress dragging like lead as she fought through the final stretch. Her feet touched bottom just as the log broke apart completely. Clara stumbled through shallows and collapsed on muddy banked chest, heaving with exhaustion and relief. She was alive, but barely soaked, bound, and stranded in hostile territory with killers hunting her trail. A footstep on wet sand made her freeze. Through morning mist, a figure emerged from the cottonwoods, tall, lean, moving with the fluid grace of a born predator. Clara's heart hammered as she recognized a Comanche warrior, his long black hair decorated with eagle feathers and his bronze skin marked with ritual scars that spoke of battles survived. Kicking Horse had watched the white woman struggle from concealment warrior instincts, warring with curiosity about circumstances that had led to her predicament. Few white women traveled alone in Comanche territory, and fewer still ended up in rivers before dawn with bound hands. Something about her desperate fight for survival reminded him painfully of his daughter Evening Star, lost to white man's diseases the previous winter. The woman looked up at him with green eyes that held fear but not surrender. Most whites cowered when confronted by Comanche warriors, but this one met his gaze directly, as if measuring his intentions rather than begging for mercy. Kicking Horse approached slowly, hands visible and empty of weapons. He spoke in Comanche, then tried broken English when she failed to respond. "Not as you hurt." His voice carried the careful cadence of someone speaking an unfamiliar language. Clara's mind raced through limited options. Running was impossible in her condition, fighting absurd against a trained warrior. Communication offered her only hope. "My hands," she managed, turning to show rope binding her wrists. "Please." Kicking Horse studied her face for deception, then moved behind her to examine the bonds. The rope was tight enough to cut circulation, tied with careless brutality of men who expected their victim to die quickly. He drew a wicked blade and sliced through restraints with surgical precision. Clara rubbed her wrists, trying to restore feeling to numb fingers. The simple act of moving her arms freely felt miraculous after hours of captivity. "Thank you." The words seemed inadequate for someone who had just saved her life. Kicking Horse sheathed his knife and squatted beside her dark eyes, studying her face with unsettling intensity. When he spoke, his English was slow but comprehensible. "White men throw you in river." Clara nodded, fresh tears threatening, as the full horror crashed over her. "They killed my father. Now they want to kill me for land that holds their secrets." The warrior's expression darkened. He had seen enough of white civilization to understand the casual cruelty that drove men to murder for profit. His own people had been displaced and slaughtered by settlers who viewed Comanche territory as empty land waiting to be claimed. "You come," Kicking Horse stood and offered his hand. "My people help." Clara hesitated, knowing that accepting would make her a fugitive from both white and Indian justice. But the alternative was certain death at Morrison and Hawkins's hands. She took his hand and allowed him to pull her to her feet. The Comanche camp occupied a natural basin hidden among red sandstone cliffs, invisible from any direction except the narrow canyon that served as entrance. Dozens of teepees arranged in careful patterns spoke of a people who understood both community and defense, while horse herds grazed in meadows that could be quickly cleared if enemies approached. Clara's arrival sent ripples of concern through the camp. Women gathered children closer, while warriors fingered weapons, uncertain whether this white woman represented opportunity or disaster. Kicking Horse spoke rapidly in Comanche to a group of elders, his gestures indicating Clara and the direction from which they had come. An elderly woman with silver-streaked hair approached Clara, her weathered face kind but cautious. She spoke in heavily accented English words, chosen with obvious care. "I am Tana. Kicking Horse tells us white men tried to kill you." This truth, Clara nodded, suddenly aware of how she must look. Bedraggled, exhausted, her gold dress torn and stained with river mud. "They threw me in the river to drown. Kicking Horse saved my life." Tana's eyes narrowed as she processed this information. Why white men want kill white woman? Or for land, and for secrets buried beneath it. "A powerful man in my town will kill anyone who threatens his masters in distant cities." The explanation seemed to satisfy Tana, who had witnessed enough white greed to understand its casual brutality. She barked orders in Comanche, and several women began preparing a place for Clara near the central fire, along with dry clothes and food. "You stay with us until safe," Tana decided. "But you must learn our ways, speak our words. White soldiers come sometimes seeking captives. You must become invisible." Clara spent the following days absorbing Comanche customs and language, her facility with learning serving her well as she adapted to tribal rhythms. The work was demanding, but purposeful, tanning hides, preparing food, mending clothes, with skills transferred from her seamstress training. More importantly, she began learning survival techniques that would prove crucial in the trials ahead. Kicking Horse watched her adaptation with approval, tinged by melancholy. Clara's determination reminded him painfully of Evening Star, who had shown the same resilience before fever claimed her. "You learn like warrior," he observed one evening, as Clara practiced with a Comanche bow under his patient instruction. "Most whites expect protection without learning to protect themselves." "I have to learn." Clara replied, her aim improving with each arrow. "The skills you're teaching might mean the difference between life and death." Kicking Horse nodded approvingly as Clara's arrow struck near the target's center. "Fear makes prey. Knowledge makes hunter. Which you choose to be." Clara drew another arrow, feeling the bow's tension mirror her own growing strength. "Hunter. Definitely hunter." Their training sessions became a regular part of Clara's routine, conducted in mixture of English and Comanche, that gradually shifted toward more of the latter as her vocabulary expanded. Through these exchanges, she learned about Kicking Horse's loss and began understanding the depth of generosity he had shown. "Your daughter," Clara ventured one evening as they watched sunset paint canyon walls crimson. "Tana told me she died from white man's disease." Kicking Horse's face remained impassive, but Clara caught the flash of pain in his dark eyes. Evening Star was 7 winters. She wanted to learn the white woman's sewing like you do. I told her someday we would trade with peaceful whites, learn their skills. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate, but Clara sensed Kicking Horse needed to hear them from someone who understood loss. The white man's diseases kill many of our children. Kicking Horse continued his voice, carrying the weight of accumulated grief. We have no medicine for smallpox, no way to fight what we cannot see. Evening Star? She suffered much before spirits called her home. Clara reached out and touched his arm, a gesture that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier, but now felt natural. She would have been proud of you for saving my life. Children understand kindness better than adults. Kicking Horse looked at her with something approaching surprise. You speak like Comanche woman, not white. Most whites think we are animals who feel nothing. Most whites have never lived among your people, Clara replied. I've learned more about honor and community in these weeks than in 16 years of so-called civilization. Their growing friendship did not pass unnoticed among other Comanche, some of whom viewed Clara's presence as a dangerous liability. War Chief Red Hawk, in particular, argued that harboring a white woman would eventually bring soldiers down upon them all. She must go. Red Hawk declared during a council meeting Clara was not permitted to attend. White soldiers will use her disappearance as excuse for war. Better to kill her now than risk our people's blood. Kicking Horse stood to face his rival, his voice carrying the authority of a respected warrior. I gave my word she would be protected. To break that word would dishonor us all. Your word matters less than our children's lives. Red Hawk countered his own voice, rough with old grief. This white woman brings death just as her people always do. The debate might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by scouts bearing urgent news. A large force of white men had been spotted moving toward the canyon system, not a random patrol, but a deliberate expedition equipped for extended operations. They come for the woman, Red Hawk announced with grim satisfaction. Now do you see the danger of your mercy-kicking horse? Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her as implications sank in. Wade's men had somehow tracked her to the Comanche camp, or perhaps they were conducting systematic searches of the territory. Either way, her presence had brought exactly the kind of trouble Red Hawk had predicted. I have to leave. Clara announced, her voice cutting through worried murmurs. If they're coming for me, I won't let your people suffer for my problems. Kicking Horse shook his head firmly. You leave alone, you die. White men kill you, then probably attack us anyway, claim we were hiding criminals. Then what do you suggest? Tana spoke up from her position among the women, her weathered face thoughtful. We move camp. Canyon has other exits paths white men don't know. We take you deeper into sacred lands where soldiers fear to tread. The proposal sparked immediate debate among the tribal council. Moving an entire camp was a massive undertaking that would disrupt hunting, trading, and the careful seasonal rhythms that governed Comanche life. But the alternative, fighting a pitched battle against superior numbers, offered even less appeal. In the end, Kicking Horse's influence proved decisive. The Comanche had survived by adapting to changing circumstances, and Clara represented both a moral obligation and a potential source of valuable information about white intentions. The evacuation began immediately, with practiced efficiency that spoke of a people long accustomed to mobility. Clara threw herself into the work, helping to dismantle teepees and pack supplies, while trying to ignore hostile glances from Comanche who blamed her for their displacement. Don't let Red Hawk's anger trouble you, Tana advised as they loaded travois with the belongings of an entire community. He lost 2 sons to white soldiers last year. His hatred burns hot, but his wisdom runs shallow when grief clouds his judgment. Clara nodded, understanding the war chief's position, even while fearing its implications for her safety and that of her protectors. The Comanche had every reason to distrust whites, and her presence among them represented a dangerous gamble. The new campsite lay 10 miles deeper in the canyon system, accessible only through a narrow defile that could be easily defended by a handful of warriors. Hidden meadows provided grazing for horses, while natural springs offered fresh water. But the location felt temporary, like a refuge rather than a home. As the Comanche settled into their new surroundings, Clara found herself wrestling with guilt over the disruption her presence had caused. These people had shown her kindness when she had no claim on their protection, and their reward was exile from ancestral lands they had occupied for generations. Kicking Horse found her sitting alone by the central fire. 3 days after the move, her expression troubled as she stared into flames that reminded her of the pyre her life had become. "You carry burden that belongs to others," he observed, settling beside her with the fluid grace that marked all his movements. "Doesn't it belong to me?" Clara asked. "Your people are hiding in these canyons because of me. If I hadn't come here, you would still be in your traditional camping grounds. White soldiers would find other reasons to hunt us." Kicking Horse replied with the weary certainty of experience. "Your people want our land just like the man who wanted yours. We fight because we must not, because you brought war to our doorstep." Clara considered his words while watching sparks rise toward the star-scattered sky. "In my town, there's a man who controls everything: the law, the land, the people. He decides who prospers and who suffers. Is it the same with your people?" Kicking Horse shook his head. "Comanche choose leaders by wisdom and courage, not by how much they own. A chief who serves himself instead of his people soon finds himself leading no one. That sounds like a better system than ours. All systems fail when men's hearts turn to greed." Kicking Horse observed with the philosophical tone that Clara had come to associate with his deepest thoughts. "The question is whether good people will stand against evil when the moment comes to choose." His words echoed in Clara's mind as she tried to sleep that night, wrapped in buffalo robes beneath the canyon's protective walls. Somewhere beyond these barriers, Judge Wade was consolidating his power and probably spreading lies about her disappearance. Her mother might already be dead, another victim of his ruthless ambition and the conspiracy he served. The thought filled her with fury that burned hotter than grief. Wade had destroyed her family, scattered the Comanche from their homes, and corrupted an entire town through fear and greed. Someone needed to stand against his evil, as Kicking Horse had said. But Clara felt impossibly small against such entrenched corruption. Her brooding was interrupted by urgent voices from the camp's perimeter. Clara sat up, recognizing the tone of alarm, even without understanding the rapid Comanche words. Something was wrong: scouts returning with bad news, or perhaps sentries reporting movement in the canyon approaches. Kicking Horse appeared at her side, his face grim in the firelight. "Runners from town?" he explained tersely. "They bring news of your people." Clara's heart clenched with dread. "My mother, she lives but barely. The white chief Wade has taken her to the sick house, spreads word that you ran away in shame after refusing his generous help." Relief at her mother's survival warred with rage at Wade's manipulation. The judge was using Margaret McKenzie as bait, keeping her alive just long enough to draw Clara out of hiding. It was calculated cruelty that revealed the true depth of his malice. "I have to go back," Clara announced, already reaching for her few possessions. "But that is exactly what he wants," Kicking Horse warned. "You return to town, you die. Then your mother dies anyway, and Wade wins everything he desired. I can't let her suffer for my choices. She's innocent in all this." Tana approached from the shadows, her weathered face thoughtful. "There might be another way," she said slowly. "White man's law, even corrupt law, still needs appearance of justice. If we could prove this Wade's crimes, expose them before witnesses who matter." Clara shook her head in frustration. "He controls the courts, the sheriff, half the businesses in town. Who would believe accusations from a supposedly dead woman and a band of Comanche? Not all whites are corrupt," Kicking Horse observed. Your father tried to fight this, Wade. Perhaps others would also if they knew the full truth and had reason to act. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more scouts and these bearing news that sent a chill through the entire camp. A large military force had been spotted moving toward the canyon system, not the random patrol they had feared, but a deliberate expedition equipped for extended operations and accompanied by territorial officials. Wade has convinced the army that we're hostile, Red Hawk announced grimly as he joined the council. They come to rescue the captive white woman and punish the savages who dared to shelter her from justice. Clara felt the weight of every gaze in the camp, understanding that her continued presence among the Comanche had become a death sentence for them all. Wade had found the perfect weapon to destroy her protectors while maintaining his facade of respectability and concern for law and order. I have to surrender myself, Clara said quietly. It's the only way to save your people from a massacre they don't deserve. If you surrender, you die, Kicking Horse stated flatly. Wade cannot let you live to tell the truth about his crimes or his masters. Then what do you suggest I won't have Comanche blood on my hands? The debate was cut short by the sound of hoofbeats echoing through the canyon. A single rider approached under a white flag, unusual but not unprecedented in negotiations between whites and Indians. The Comanche allowed him to enter their camp, though dozens of weapons remained trained on his back as he dismounted. The messenger was a young cavalry lieutenant, clearly nervous, but determined to carry out his orders with military precision. He kept his hands visible as he approached the tribal council, his uniform crisp despite days of hard riding. I bear a message from Judge Cornelius Wade of Cedar Falls, he announced in a voice that tried to project authority despite his obvious youth. He offers terms for the peaceful return of Miss Clara McKenzie. What terms? Kicking Horse asked, though his tone suggested he expected treachery. The lieutenant unfolded a formal document, reading from it with the stilted cadence of official pronouncement. Miss McKenzie is to surrender herself immediately for return to her rightful place in civilized society. In exchange, Judge Wade guarantees safe passage for this band to reservations in the Oklahoma Territory, along with supplies sufficient for the journey and protection from prosecution for harboring a fugitive. And if we refuse this generous offer? Red Hawk inquired, his voice dripping with sarcasm that transcended language barriers. Then the United States Army will consider this band to be in violation of federal law, harboring a kidnapped citizen against her will. Force will be used to secure Miss McKenzie's release and punish those responsible for her unlawful captivity. Clara felt sick at the casual way her supposed rescue was being used to justify the destruction of an entire community. Wade had maneuvered brilliantly, positioning himself as the hero saving a helpless woman from savage captors, while simultaneously eliminating the witnesses to his crimes. How do we know Judge Wade will honor his promises? Clara asked, stepping forward to address the lieutenant directly. The young officer's eyes widened with surprise at seeing her apparently unharmed and speaking freely. Whatever he had expected to find among the Comanche, it clearly wasn't a composed young woman engaging in diplomatic negotiations. Judge Wade is a respected member of the territorial government. The lieutenant replied, uncertainly. His word carries the weight of law throughout this region. Clara almost laughed at the bitter irony. His word is worth exactly nothing, Lieutenant. This man murdered my father, tried to kill me, and is holding my mother hostage to force my surrender. If you return me to him, you'll be delivering me to my executioner. The lieutenant's composure cracked slightly as he struggled to reconcile Clara's articulate accusations with the official narrative he had been fed. Miss McKenzie, I understand you may have formed attachments to your captors during your ordeal. But Judge Wade assures me you've been held against your will and possibly subjected to influences that have affected your judgment. I came here voluntarily seeking protection from Judge Wade's murderous schemes. Clara replied firmly, These people saved my life, when his hired killers threw me in the river to drown. They've shown me more honor and decency than anyone in my supposedly civilized hometown." The officer looked around the camp, taking in the evident prosperity and organization of the Comanche band. Clara could see him struggling to reconcile the reality before him with the stories of savage barbarism he had been told. "I have my orders, Miss McKenzie. You must return with me to face whatever charges may be pending." "And if I refuse?" The lieutenant's hand moved unconsciously toward his sidearm. "Then I'm afraid force will be necessary to secure your release." The tension in the camp ratcheted higher as warriors fingered their weapons, understanding that any violence would provide Wade with the justification he needed for a full-scale massacre. Clara realized she stood at the fulcrum of a moment that could determine the fate of dozens of innocent people. "Lieutenant." Clara's voice carried an authority that surprised even herself. "I'll make you a counter-proposal. Give me 3 days to gather evidence of Judge Wade's crimes. If I can prove his guilt to your satisfaction, will you arrest him instead of protecting him?" The young officer looked genuinely torn between his orders and his growing doubts about the situation. "Miss McKenzie, I don't have authority to negotiate with—" "You have authority to prevent a massacre based on false pretenses." Clara interrupted. "If Judge Wade is the criminal, I claim he is, then your orders are based on lies designed to eliminate witnesses to his conspiracy. Surely the United States Army doesn't knowingly serve corrupt interests?" The lieutenant's military training warred with his conscience as he processed the implications of Clara's words. Everything he had been told suggested he would find a traumatized captive, desperate for rescue, not an articulate young woman making reasoned arguments about official corruption. On 3 days, he finally agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll need substantial proof, real evidence, not just accusations and hearsay." Clara felt a surge of hope tempered by the magnitude of the task before her. 3 days to expose a corruption network that had taken years to establish with resources limited to what she could accomplish while hiding in hostile territory. "I'll need to return to Cedar Falls," Clara announced. "The evidence is there, hidden where my father left it." Kicking Horse shook his head firmly. "You go to town, Wade kills you before you find anything. This I know with certainty. Not if I'm careful. Not if I have the right kind of help." Tana stepped forward, her weathered face thoughtful as she studied Clara's determined expression. White woman in Comanche clothes moving at night through shadows might pass unnoticed where Clara McKenzie would be recognized and captured. The plan that emerged from their hurried conference was audacious in its simplicity. Clara would infiltrate Cedar Falls disguised as a Comanche woman, relying on darkness and the racial prejudices of white settlers to avoid recognition. Most whites wouldn't look closely at an Indian face, assuming all natives looked alike and posed no individual threat. Kicking Horse would accompany her both as protection and as someone familiar with moving unseen through hostile territory. They would have 2 nights to search for Thomas Mackenzie's hidden evidence before the lieutenant's deadline expired and military force became inevitable. "There's something else you should know," Kicking Horse said as Tana helped Clara dress in traditional Comanche clothing, leather dress, beaded moccasins, and a blanket to hide her distinctive auburn hair. "Your father, before he died, he came to our trading post seeking medicine for your mother. He spoke of great danger hidden beneath your land, something that would bring many bad men if the truth became known." Clara's pulse quickened as implications crashed over her. "What kind of danger?" "He called it cursed silver metal that makes men mad with greed and drives them to kill without conscience. But he said he had found proof of something worse than silver proof that would hang powerful men in distant cities if it ever saw sunlight." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow, confirming her worst suspicions about the scope of the conspiracy her father had uncovered. The Mackenzie land wasn't just valuable for its silver deposits, it was crucial to exposing a network of corruption that reached far beyond territorial boundaries. "If we're caught, we're both dead," Clara warned as they prepared to leave the canyon's protective embrace. "We're dead anyway if Wade's lies succeed." Kicking Horse replied grimly. At least this way we die fighting for truth instead of hiding from it. The journey to Cedar Falls took most of the night, following game trails and creek beds that avoided main roads where they might encounter patrols. Clara marveled at Kicking Horse's ability to navigate in complete darkness, moving through terrain that would have been impassable to someone without his wilderness skills. They reached the outskirts of town just before dawn, concealing themselves in an abandoned root cellar while they observed the pattern of Wade's security measures. The judge had posted guards at key locations throughout Cedar Falls: the courthouse, the bank, the sheriff's office, and notably, the building that housed Dr. Harrison's medical practice. He's afraid, Clara realized as she watched a nervous deputy pace his assigned route with obvious reluctance. All this security isn't just about finding me. He's worried about something else, something that's making him paranoid. Kicking Horse pointed toward the building where Clara's mother was supposedly being treated. Your mother, she is there. Clara nodded, her heart clenching at thought of Margaret McKenzie lying helpless while her daughter played dangerous games in the darkness. We need to get word to her somehow. Let her know I'm alive and fighting. First, we find evidence, Kicking Horse said firmly. Then we save your mother. Cannot do one without the other. They waited until full darkness before making their move, slipping through back alleys toward the McKenzie family home. Clara's heart broke at the sight of her childhood sanctuary windows, boarded up weeds choking her mother's garden, an official notice nailed to the front door declaring the property seized for unpaid debts. Wade didn't waste time, Clara whispered bitterly as Kicking Horse examined the locks on the back door with practiced eyes. The interior felt like a tomb filled with furniture covered in dust sheets and the lingering scent of her mother's lavender sachets. Clara moved through familiar rooms by memory, searching for hiding places her father might have used for his most dangerous secrets. Thomas McKenzie had been methodical about everything, keeping receipts filed by date tools, organized by function medicines, labeled and stored properly. But if he had been gathering evidence against Wade and his Eastern masters, he would have hidden it somewhere the judge's men wouldn't think to look during their inevitable searches. Clara found the first clue in her father's workshop behind the main house, a loose floorboard beneath his workbench that revealed a small cavity lined with oiled leather. Inside lay a journal wrapped in the waterproof cloth, along with what appeared to be surveyor's maps and legal documents that made her breath catch. Father's handwriting. Clara breathed as she opened the journal by candlelight. The entries detailed months of careful investigation into Wade's activities, complete with dates, witnesses, and documentation of the judge's systematic corruption. But it was more than simple land fraud. Thomas McKenzie had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that stretched from Cedar Falls to mining syndicates in Chicago and New York. Wade was merely a local agent in a vast network designed to steal territorial resources through murder fraud and the corruption of federal officials. Your father was brave beyond measure, Kicking Horse observed as Clara read selected passages aloud. He knew the danger, but continued seeking truth anyway. The journal's final entries revealed the true scope of what Thomas had discovered. The silver deposits beneath their land were just one part of a massive operation involving dozens of properties across 3 territories. Eastern interests were systematically looting the West's mineral wealth, using corrupt judges like Wade to clear legal obstacles through violence. But Thomas had found something that terrified the conspirators even more than exposure evidence: that they had been bribing federal officials to alter territorial boundaries, ensuring that mineral-rich lands would fall under the jurisdiction of their puppet judges when statehood came. This could hang a dozen men in Washington, Clara whispered as she absorbed the implications. No wonder Wade is so desperate to silence anyone who might know about Father's investigation. They were still examining the evidence when footsteps echoed on the front porch, heavy boots, and the distinctive jingle of spurs that announced Wade's hired killers making their rounds. Kicking Horse blew out the candle and motioned for absolute silence as voices carried through the thin walls. Judge wants us to tear this place apart again. Dutch Morrison's gravelly voice held an edge of frustration. "Says the old man might have hidden something we missed." "We already searched every inch twice," Bill Hawkins complained. "Wasn't nothing here but dust and mouse droppings the first time. Wade thinks different now. Got word from his eastern friends that McKenzie might have found papers that could hang them all. Says we need to be thorough this time, burn the place down if we have to." Clara clutched her father's journal to her chest, realizing how close she had come to losing the only proof of the conspiracy's existence. If Morrison and Hawkins conducted a truly systematic search, they would eventually discover the hidden cavity. Kicking Horse drew his knife and pointed toward the back door, but Clara shook her head. Any attempt to leave would create noise that would alert the searchers to their presence. Their only option was to remain hidden and hope Wade's men would conduct another cursory investigation. The sound of furniture being overturned and drawers being yanked open suggested otherwise. Morrison and Hawkins were being thorough this time, probably motivated by fear of what their eastern employers might do if crucial evidence surfaced. "Check the workshop," Morrison ordered as their search progressed through the main house. Old man spent most of his time out there. If he hid something, that's where it would be. The door opened with a squeal of rusted hinges, and lamplight flickered across the workshop's interior. Clara and Kicking Horse pressed themselves against the far wall, hidden behind a rack of Thomas Mackenzie's carpentry tools, as Hawkins began systematically examining every surface. "Found something," Hawkins announced, his voice suddenly alert. "Floorboard's been pried up recently. Cavity underneath, but it's empty now." Clara's heart stopped as she realized their hiding place had been discovered. Morrison's boots echoed across the workshop floor as he came to examine Hawkins's find. Fresh scratches on the wood. Morrison observed grimly. "Someone's been here recent-like, maybe tonight even." The two killers began searching the workshop with renewed intensity, checking every shadow and corner where intruders might be concealing themselves. Clara could hear them moving closer to the tool rack that provided their only cover. Kicking Horse tensed beside her, preparing for the fight that seemed inevitable. His hand moved to the war hatchet at his belt, while Clara's fingers found the knife he had taught her to use. They might die in the next few minutes, but they would sell their lives dearly. "Wait," Morrison said suddenly, his voice sharp with realization. "You hear that?" Clara strained her ears and caught the sound that had alerted the killer: distant shouts and the orange glow of fire visible through the workshop's single window. Something was burning in Cedar Falls, something big enough to demand immediate attention. "The warehouse district's on fire," Hawkins observed, peering through the window. "Wade's gonna want every man fighting that blaze before it spreads to the business district." Morrison cursed creatively, but began moving toward the door. "We'll finish searching later. Right now, we better get down there before the whole town burns down." They left at a run, their boots pounding across the yard, as they headed toward the growing conflagration that lit the night sky with hellish orange light. Clara and Kicking Horse waited several minutes before daring to move, ensuring the killers were truly gone. "The fire," Clara whispered as they emerged from hiding. "Did you?" Tana's work, Kicking Horse, confirmed with grim satisfaction. She said white men always panic when they see flames. Creates opportunities for those who keep calm heads. Clara felt a surge of gratitude for the Comanche woman's strategic thinking. The diversion had probably saved their lives, but it also meant their time was limited. Once the fire was contained, Morrison and Hawkins would return to complete their search. "We need to get this evidence to safe hands." Clara decided, securing her father's journal beneath her Comanche clothing. "But first, we have to check on my mother." The journey to Dr. Harrison's office required careful navigation through streets filled with men rushing toward the warehouse fire. Clara's disguise proved effective in the chaos and flickering light. No one looked closely at what appeared to be just another Indian woman moving through the shadows. The doctor's office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building near the town center, with living quarters upstairs and a small ward for patients too sick to care for at home. Light glowed in one of the upper windows, suggesting someone was awake despite the late hour and distant commotion. Clara's heart leaped as she recognized her mother's sleeping form through the window, thinner than before, her face drawn with pain, but alive and breathing steadily. Dr. Harrison dozed in a chair beside Margaret McKenzie's bed, a medical journal open across his lap. The climb to the second-floor window tested Clara's nerve, but her time among the Comanche had made her comfortable with physical challenges. Kicking Horse moved like smoke, his warrior training evident in every fluid motion as they gained access to the building's interior. Clara approached the sleeping doctor quietly, not wanting to startle him into an outcry that might alert Wade's remaining guards. She touched his shoulder gently, and Harrison's eyes snapped open with the practiced alertness of someone accustomed to midnight medical emergencies. "Don't make a sound," Clara whispered urgently. "It's Clara McKenzie." Harrison's eyes widened with shock and confusion as he recognized her face beneath the Comanche war paint. "Clara, but you're supposed to be dead. Judge Wade said you drowned in the river trying to escape justice. Judge Wade tried to have me murdered," Clara replied, keeping her voice low. "His men threw me in the Colorado River to drown. How is my mother?" The doctor glanced nervously at Kicking Horse, who had positioned himself by the window as lookout. "She's been asking for you constantly. The fever broke 2 days ago, but she remains very weak." Margaret McKenzie stirred at the sound of familiar voices, her eyes opening with the confused slowness of someone emerging from drugged sleep. When she focused on Clara's face, tears began streaming down her cheeks. "Clara, oh my dear girl, they told me you were dead. Wade said you ran away in shame after he tried to help us." Clara knelt beside her mother's bed, taking her hand and squeezing gently. "I'm alive, Mama. I've been hiding with friends, gathering evidence against Judge Wade and his conspiracy. Your father's papers." Margaret whispered urgently, her voice barely audible. "Did you find them? Thomas said they would protect us if anything happened to him." Clara nodded, patting the journal hidden beneath her clothing. Everything he discovered about Wade's crimes and his Eastern masters. Enough evidence to hang a dozen men for treason and murder. Dr. Harrison looked between mother and daughter with growing understanding and horror. "Judge Wade claimed Clara ran away after he offered to help with your medical bills. Said she was ungrateful and possibly involved with criminal elements. The Wade's men threw me in the river to drown," Clara explained tersely. "They would have killed my mother too if I hadn't agreed to go quietly." The implications hit Harrison like a physical blow. As the truth dawned on him, his face grew pale with a terrible realization. "That means the medication I've been giving your mother, the special treatment Wade insisted on paying for." Clara's blood chilled as she understood the doctor's dawning horror. What kind of medication? Laudanum for pain, but in doses that seemed unusually high. Wade said it was important to keep her comfortable during her recovery, that she needed strong medicine to overcome her grief. Margaret McKenzie's hand tightened on Clara's fingers. "I've been feeling so tired, so confused. Sometimes I couldn't remember things, couldn't think clearly." The picture was becoming sickeningly clear. Wade had been slowly poisoning Margaret McKenzie while maintaining the facade of charitable medical care, probably planning to claim she died of grief over her daughter's disappearance. Another convenient death to eliminate a potential witness. But as Clara processed this revelation, she noticed something that made her heart race with a different kind of fear. Dr. Harrison's medical bag sat open beside her mother's bed, and inside she could see several vials of medication, including one that bore a label she recognized with growing alarm. "Doctor," Clara said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. "That medication with the red wax seal. When did Judge Wade give you that particular treatment?" Harrison followed her gaze to the vial in question, his face growing even paler as he understood the significance of her question. "Yesterday evening. He said it was a new formulation from a colleague back east, specially prepared for your mother's condition." I was supposed to administer it tonight, said it would help her sleep peacefully. Clara felt the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. Wade hadn't just been poisoning her mother slowly. He had been planning to kill her tonight, probably while using Dr. Harrison as an unwitting accomplice, who could be blamed for Margaret McKenzie's death when suspicion arose. "Doctor, I need you to listen very carefully." Clara said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Judge Wade has been using you to slowly murder my mother. That medication isn't treatment. It's poison designed to kill her tonight." Harrison stared at the vial as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. "But I've been giving her medication for days. If what you're saying is true, then you've been saving her life by keeping the doses small," Clara realized. "Wade probably told you to increase the dosage gradually, didn't he? Building up to tonight's fatal dose." The doctor nodded numbly, his hands shaking as the full scope of his manipulation became clear. He said her body needed time to adjust to the stronger medicine. "I was supposed to give her double the usual amount tonight, said it would help her rest peacefully through her grief." Clara felt sick at how close they had come to disaster. If she had arrived even one day later, her mother would have been dead, and Dr. Harrison would have been left holding evidence of his unwitting participation in murder. "We have to get her out of here," Clara decided. "Tonight, before Wade realizes his plan has failed and tries something more direct." "And where can we take her?" Harrison asked, his medical ethics finally overriding his fear of Wade's retribution. "She's still too weak to travel far, and Wade has men watching every building in town." Kicking Horse spoke for the first time since entering the building, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. "Comanche, protect those who seek justice. Your mother would be safe with our people until she grows strong enough to fight." The doctor stared at the warrior with mixture of fear and fascination, clearly struggling with the implications of turning his patient over to people he had been taught to view as dangerous savages. "You're asking me to trust my patient's life to—" Harrison's voice trailed off as he realized the absurdity of his objection. "To people who have shown more honor than anyone in this town." Clara finished firmly. "These Comanche saved my life when Judge Wade tried to murder me. They've protected me when my own people wanted me dead." Harrison looked around the room, taking in the evidence of Wade's manipulation and the obvious desperation of their situation. Conventional medicine offered no protection against the kind of systematic corruption they faced. "All right," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "God help us all, but you're right. Wade has made it impossible to trust anyone in authority." The escape proved more challenging than expected, complicated by the ongoing fire in the warehouse district that had drawn most of Wade's men, but also filled the streets with confused citizens and volunteer firefighters. They had to move carefully, avoiding main thoroughfares, while supporting Margaret McKenzie, who was barely strong enough to walk. Dr. Harrison proved unexpectedly resourceful, using his medical authority to commandeer a wagon from a local merchant who was too concerned about the fire to ask questions. They loaded Margaret onto a bed of blankets in the wagon bed, with Clara and Kicking Horse hidden beneath canvas covers. The journey to the canyon stronghold took most of the remaining night, with frequent stops to ensure Margaret McKenzie could endure the travel without suffering a complete collapse. But by dawn, they had reached the relative safety of the Comanche camp, where Tana immediately took charge of the patient's care. "Your mother will recover," Tana assured Clara as she examined Margaret with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with poison victims before. "The bad medicine leaves her body slowly, but good medicine will make her strong again." Dr. Harrison worked alongside the Comanche healers with growing amazement, his medical training complementing their traditional knowledge in ways that benefited Margaret's recovery. The collaboration represented a bridging of cultures that might have been impossible under other circumstances. But their brief moment of triumph was interrupted by urgent news from scouts who had been monitoring Wade's activities in Cedar Falls. The judge had discovered Margaret McKenzie's escape and was mobilizing every available resource for a massive manhunt. that would sweep the entire territory. He's lost all pretense of civilized behavior, Clara realized as she studied the reports. Desperation is making him reckless enough to show his true nature. Lieutenant Morrison, the young cavalry officer who had agreed to Clara's 3-day deadline, appeared at the camp's entrance under a flag of truce. But his expression was grim as he approached the tribal council, suggesting that circumstances had changed dramatically since their previous meeting. "Miss McKenzie," he said without preamble, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I'm afraid our agreement is void. Judge Wade has presented new evidence that you and your Comanche allies murdered Dr. Harrison and kidnapped your mother. My superiors have ordered your immediate arrest." Clara felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she realized Wade's latest manipulation. The judge had somehow turned their rescue of Margaret McKenzie into another crime, probably by claiming that Dr. Harrison had been killed when he tried to prevent the savage kidnapping of his patient. "Dr. Harrison is alive and well," Clara announced, gesturing toward the physician who was tending to her mother nearby. "He's here voluntarily helping to save my mother's life from Judge Wade's poison." The lieutenant looked genuinely surprised to see Harrison unharmed and apparently working cooperatively with the Comanche. But his military training kept him focused on his orders, despite this contradiction of the official narrative. "I'm relieved to see the doctor is safe," Morrison said carefully. "But I still have direct orders from territorial headquarters. Judge Wade has convinced the governor that you're leading a hostile uprising designed to steal territorial resources." Clara pulled her father's journal from its hiding place, holding it up so the lieutenant could see the evidence they had risked their lives to recover. "This contains proof that Judge Wade is the one stealing territorial resources, working with Eastern syndicates to loot the West's mineral wealth through murder and fraud." Morrison accepted the journal reluctantly, his expression skeptical, until he began reading Thomas Mackenzie's careful documentation. Clara watched his face change as the scope of Wade's corruption became clear, not just local land fraud, but a conspiracy involving territorial officials, federal agents, and mining interests that stretched across state lines. "This is extensive," Morrison admitted after several minutes of reading. "But how do I know these aren't fabrications designed to discredit Judge Wade and justify your actions?" Clara had anticipated this question and was prepared with an answer that would force the lieutenant to confront the logical inconsistencies in Wade's story. "Because Wade's own actions prove the journal's accuracy," she replied firmly. "Why would he try to kill me if I were just a hysterical young woman making false accusations? Why poison my mother? Why go to such extreme lengths to claim our family's land if it held nothing more valuable than farming potential?" She pulled out the geological surveys her father had hidden alongside his journal documents that revealed the true extent of the mineral wealth beneath seemingly worthless frontier properties. "Our land sits on top of silver deposits worth millions of dollars, Lieutenant. Wade has known about them for months, using his position to access confidential mining reports that aren't available to the public. That's why he's so desperate to eliminate anyone who might expose his conspiracy." Morrison studied the surveys with growing amazement, cross-referencing them with the journal entries that documented Wade's systematic acquisition of mineral-rich properties through intimidation and murder. "If this information is accurate," Morrison said slowly, "then Judge Wade and his associates are guilty of conspiracy fraud and multiple murders in service of what amounts to the largest theft in territorial history." "What now? You're beginning to understand the scope of what we're fighting," Clara confirmed. "This isn't just about one corrupt judge, it's about a network of criminals who are systematically looting the American West." The lieutenant was still processing the implications when shouts from the camp's perimeter interrupted their conversation. Wade had arrived with a force that made Clara's heart sink, not just his hired guns and territorial militia, but federal troops convinced they were facing a full-scale Indian uprising led by a deranged white woman. Fya, come out, Clara McKenzie. Wade's voice echoed across the canyon, amplified by the natural acoustics of the rock walls. Come out and face justice for your crimes against the people of this territory. Clara could see Wade positioned at the head of his army, surrounded by armed men, and backed by the authority of territorial and federal government. He looked confident, almost triumphant, probably believing he had finally cornered his quarry and could eliminate the last threats to his conspiracy. But Clara had learned much during her time among the Comanche, lessons about courage, strategy, and the power of unexpected tactics that could turn apparent defeat into victory. Instead of cowering in the canyon, she made a decision that surprised everyone present. "I'm going out there," she announced, checking the weapons Kicking Horse had taught her to use. "It's time to end this once and for all." "Clara, no," Margaret McKenzie called weakly from her bed. "He'll kill you the moment you show yourself." "And not if I kill him first," Clara replied with grim determination. "Wade has been using the law as a weapon against innocent people. It's time someone used justice as a weapon against him." Kicking Horse stepped forward, his weathered face grave, with the solemnity of someone about to perform a sacred ritual. "If you go out there, you go as Comanche warrior. We have ceremony for those who choose death before dishonor." The ritual was brief but meaningful. Tana painting Clara's face with traditional war paint, while Kicking Horse blessed her weapons and offered prayers to the spirits of warriors who had fallen in righteous battles. When it was finished, Clara McKenzie had been transformed into something new, a bridge between two worlds, carrying the strength of both. Lieutenant Morrison watched these preparations with growing alarm, understanding that he was witnessing something unprecedented in the history of white Indian relations. "Miss McKenzie, I can't allow you to commit suicide by confronting an armed force. If you surrender peacefully, I'll do everything in my power to ensure you receive fair treatment." With Wade controlling the courts and bribing federal officials, Clara laughed bitterly. "The only fair trial any of us will get is the one I'm about to conduct in that canyon." She walked out of Comanche protection alone, her father's evidence secured in a leather pouch at her side, and her weapons concealed beneath a borrowed blanket. Wade's massive force spread across the desert floor before her. But Clara felt no fear, only the cold certainty of someone who had finally found her true purpose. The confrontation that followed would become legendary in territorial history, though different versions would emphasize different aspects of what transpired. What remained consistent across all accounts was the image of a young woman walking alone across open ground to face an army, armed with nothing but truth and the courage to speak it. To Judge Wade. Clara's voice carried clearly across the desert air, pitched to reach every man in the opposing force. "I'm here to answer your charges." Wade spurred his horse forward, flanked by Morrison and Hawkins, his face twisted with triumph and anticipation of final victory. "Clara McKenzie, you are under arrest for murder, kidnapping, conspiracy with hostile Indians, and treason against the United States government. And you, Judge Wade, are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, murder, and treason against the people of this territory," Clara replied, pulling her father's journal from its pouch and holding it high enough for everyone to see. "This contains proof of your crimes and those of your Eastern masters, documented by Thomas McKenzie before you had him murdered." Wade's confident expression flickered with uncertainty as he realized Clara possessed the evidence he had been desperately seeking. That journal is a fabrication created by a mentally unstable young woman who has been corrupted by savage influences and driven mad by guilt over her own crimes. "Then you won't mind if Lieutenant Morrison examines the evidence." Clara challenged, her voice carrying across the assembled force with startling clarity. "If these are fabrications, they should be easy to disprove before all these witnesses." The standoff stretched taut as Morrison looked between Clara and Wade, clearly struggling with competing claims and conflicting evidence. The crowd of soldiers and militia watched in tense silence, uncertain which authority to follow or which version of truth to believe. Wade solved the immediate problem by making a fatal error in judgment. Sensing that the situation was slipping from his control as doubt spread through the ranks, he drew his revolver and aimed it directly at Clara's chest. "Enough of this charade," he snarled, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I am the law in this territory, and I say this woman dies here and now for her crimes against civilization and order." The moment Wade drew his weapon, Clara threw off her blanket to reveal the war hatchet in her right hand and the weapon Kicking Horse had taught her to wield with deadly accuracy. Years of frustration, grief, and rage exploded into motion as she hurled the hatchet with all the strength and skill she possessed. The weapon struck Wade in the chest with bone-crushing force, driving him backward off his horse to hit the ground hard. His revolver spun away into the dust as blood spread across his white shirt, and for a moment, the only sound was the echo of his scream bouncing off canyon walls. Clara was already moving, drawing the knife Kicking Horse had given her as Morrison and Hawkins reached for their weapons. But she had learned more than combat skills from the Comanche. She had mastered the art of psychological warfare. "Now look at your leader," Clara shouted to the assembled force, her voice cutting through their shock and confusion. "Look at the man who convinced you to attack innocent people. He drew first blood against an unarmed woman seeking justice." Wade struggled to sit up, his face pale with shock and pain, the war hatchet still embedded in his chest, but missing vital organs by inches. "Kill her," he gasped, his voice weak but filled with desperate fury. "She's a savage. She's been corrupted by the Indians." But his words carried less weight now that the crowd could see him bleeding in the dust, victim of a young woman he had tried to murder in cold blood. Morrison hesitated, his military training warring with growing doubts about the justice of his orders. Clara seized the moment of uncertainty to present her ultimate gambit, a legal maneuver that would force a public examination of the evidence while preventing immediate violence. "Lieutenant Morrison," she called out in a voice that carried across the desert with startling authority, "I invoke my right to trial by combat under territorial law. When two parties dispute ownership of property and charges of criminal conspiracy, the matter can be settled by single combat between the principals or their chosen champions." It was an obscure legal precedent rarely invoked, but still technically valid under territorial statutes that had never been formally repealed. Wade tried to protest, but his voice was weak with blood loss, and the crowd was beginning to mutter among themselves as they processed Clara's unexpected knowledge of territorial law. "Judge Wade has accused me of crimes against this territory." Clara continued, her voice carrying with the confidence of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. "I accuse him of far worse crimes against the people he was sworn to protect. Let combat decide who speaks the truth." Morrison looked around desperately for guidance, but found none among his superiors. Wade was clearly in no condition to fight. His hired guns were reluctant to engage in what might be construed as legal proceedings, and the territorial militia had no clear orders for such an unusual situation. But before anyone could respond to Clara's challenge, the situation took an unexpected turn that changed everything. Dr. Harrison emerged from the canyon supporting Margaret McKenzie as she walked slowly but steadily across the desert floor toward the assembled crowd. "People of Cedar Falls," Harrison called out in a voice that carried the authority of someone respected throughout the community, "I have something to tell you about Judge Wade's methods of maintaining order in our territory." The crowd turned toward the doctor with surprise and curiosity, wondering what he could possibly add to the already unprecedented confrontation. Wade's eyes widened with fear as he realized his carefully constructed narrative was about to face challenges he couldn't control. Judge Wade has been systematically poisoning anyone who threatened his control. Harrison announced, his voice growing stronger as he gained confidence. "He convinced me to administer fatal doses of laudanum to Mrs. McKenzie, claiming it was medicine to ease her grief over her daughter's disappearance." A shocked gasp rippled through the crowd as the implications sank in. Harrison continued his testimony, describing in clinical detail how Wade had manipulated him into becoming an unwitting accomplice to attempted murder. Miss McKenzie saved her mother's life by exposing Wade's plot. Harrison concluded, "She risked everything to protect an innocent woman from a man who was using medical treatment as a weapon of murder." The revelation sent shockwaves through Wade's support base as people began connecting past tragedies to current accusations. Citizens who had lost loved ones under suspicious circumstances suddenly saw those deaths in a new light, while landowners who had been pressured to sell realized they had been victims of systematic fraud. Clara watched Wade's face as his empire of lies crumbled around him. The judge's pale eyes darted around the crowd, probably calculating his chances of fighting his way out of an increasingly hostile situation. But Wade had one final card to play, a trump that Clara hadn't anticipated, and that threatened to turn her moment of triumph into disaster. He reached into his coat pocket with his uninjured hand and pulled out a small brass whistle which he blew with the last of his strength. The whistle's shrill note echoed across the desert, and moments later, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of reinforcements that made Clara's heart sink. A dozen heavily armed men rode out of the canyon's far entrance, not local hired guns, but professional killers imported from the east to protect the conspiracy's interests. "Did you think I would come here without insurance?" Wade gasped, his voice barely audible, but filled with malicious satisfaction. "Meet my business associates from Chicago and New York. They have very specific instructions about what to do if this situation couldn't be resolved through normal channels." The leader of the newcomers was a thin man with dead eyes and expensive clothes that marked him as someone accustomed to urban violence rather than frontier battles. He dismounted and approached Wade with the casual confidence of someone who held all the winning cards. "I'm Mr. Wade," the man said in a cultured accent that contrasted sharply with his obvious capacity for violence. "It appears you've allowed the situation to deteriorate beyond acceptable parameters. The girl has evidence." Wade wheezed. "McKenzie's journal. It contains everything: names, dates, bank records. If it reaches Washington." The thin man nodded with professional understanding. "Then we'll have to ensure it doesn't reach Washington. Gentlemen, eliminate everyone who has seen the contents of that journal. Make it look like a tragic conflict between the army and hostile Indians." Clara felt ice form in her veins as she realized the true scope of the trap Wade had prepared. His Eastern masters were willing to massacre an entire military force to protect their conspiracy, probably planning to blame the slaughter on Comanche savages, while eliminating all witnesses to their crimes. But as the hired killers began positioning themselves for mass murder, something unexpected happened that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. War Chief Red Hawk appeared on the canyon rim above them, flanked by 24 Comanche warriors armed with rifles and positioned to rain death down on anyone who threatened their guests. Kicking Horse sends message. Red Hawk called down in English, deliberately chosen to be understood by everyone present. "Any man who harms those under Comanche protection will answer to Comanche justice." The threat was unmistakable, and it caught the Eastern killers completely off guard. They had come prepared to handle territorial lawmen and frontier farmers, not experienced warriors who held the high ground and knew every inch of the surrounding terrain. The thin man looked up at the Comanche positions with professional assessment, clearly calculating odds that didn't favor his chances of success. "This changes the tactical situation significantly," he admitted to Wade. "We'll need to reconsider our approach." But Clara wasn't willing to let the initiative slip away from her again. While everyone else was focused on the standoff between Red Hawk's warriors and the Eastern killers, she made a move that surprised everyone present. She walked directly to Lieutenant Morrison and handed him her father's journal, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Lieutenant, I formally request protection under federal law as a witness to crimes against the United States government. This journal contains evidence of conspiracy treason and murder involving territorial officials and their Eastern associates." Morrison accepted the journal with hands that shook slightly, understanding that he was being asked to choose between following orders based on lies and protecting evidence of genuine federal crimes. Furthermore, Clara continued, her voice growing stronger as she gained momentum. I request that you place Judge Wade and his associates under military arrest pending investigation by federal authorities who haven't been compromised by this conspiracy. The lieutenant looked between the journal in his hands and the various armed factions surrounding him, clearly struggling with a decision that could define his entire career. But as he began reading Thomas Mackenzie's careful documentation, his expression hardened with the resolve of someone who had finally seen enough corruption. Judge Cornelius Wade, Morrison announced in his most formal military voice. By the authority vested in me by the United States Army, I place you under arrest for conspiracy fraud, attempted murder, and treason against the United States government. Wade's scream of rage echoed across the desert as his carefully constructed world finally collapsed around him. The Eastern Killers found themselves facing a united front of federal troops, territorial militia, and Comanche warriors, odds that even professional murderers couldn't overcome. The thin man raised his hand slowly, his dead eyes calculating one final time before accepting inevitable defeat. It appears the game has changed, Mr. Wade. My associates and I will be withdrawing from this territory immediately. You can't leave me. Wade shrieked, blood frothing from his lips as the war hatchet's wound began taking its toll. We had an agreement. You promised protection. We promised protection as long as you remained useful. The thin man replied with chilling indifference. You've become a liability that threatens our entire operation. Consider our association terminated. The Eastern Killers mounted their horses and rode away without looking back, abandoning Wade to face justice alone. Clara watched them go with mixed feelings: relief that the immediate threat had passed, but frustration that the conspiracy's masterminds would escape to continue their crimes elsewhere. But Wade himself was finished, and his arrest sent shockwaves through the corrupt network he had built in Cedar Falls. Morrison and Hawkins tried to slip away in the confusion, but Comanche warriors had surrounded the entire area, cutting off all escape routes. Within minutes, Wade's entire criminal organization had collapsed. Clara felt a profound sense of completion as she watched Wade being loaded into a military wagon, the war hatchet finally removed from his chest and his hands bound with iron shackles. The symmetry felt appropriate poetic justice for a man who had built his empire on the suffering of others. The victory had come at a cost that would be calculated over the weeks that followed. Wade's conspiracy had corrupted territorial government so thoroughly that wholesale reforms would be necessary to restore honest administration. Federal investigators would spend months unraveling the network of bribes, threats, and murders that had kept the system functioning. But as Clara looked around at the mixed crowd of whites and Comanche who had witnessed Wade's downfall, she saw faces that reflected hope, determination, and the possibility of something better than what had come before. What happens now? Margaret Mackenzie asked as the family was finally reunited in safety and relative peace. Clara looked toward the distant mountains where new settlements were being established by honest families seeking honest opportunities, then at the Comanche warriors who had risked everything to protect strangers who had shown them kindness. Now we build something new, Clara replied with quiet confidence. Something based on justice instead of corruption, cooperation instead of exploitation, truth instead of lies. Lieutenant Morrison approached as the immediate crisis passed, and the various factions began preparing to return to their normal activities. Miss Mackenzie. Morrison said, his voice carrying newfound respect, born from witnessing her courage under fire. I owe you more than an apology. I came here prepared to arrest you for crimes you didn't commit, following orders based on Wade's lies and manipulation. You did your duty as you understood it. Clara replied with the grace of someone who had learned that holding grudges poisoned the holder more than the target. The fault lies with those who corrupted the system, not with those who tried to serve it honestly. Morrison nodded gratefully, understanding that Clara's forgiveness was a gift he didn't deserve, but desperately needed. "What will you do now? Your family's land will be returned, of course, and there will likely be substantial compensation for the suffering you've endured." Clara considered the question while watching Kicking Horse and Tana preparing to escort their people back to traditional camping grounds, their mission of protecting her finally complete. The Comanche had taught her invaluable lessons about courage, community, and the importance of standing up for justice, regardless of personal cost. "I think I'll study law." Clara decided, the idea crystallizing with perfect clarity as she spoke. "Someone needs to ensure what happened here never happens again. Someone needs to protect people like my father who try to stand up to corruption." The idea felt absolutely right away to honor Thomas Mackenzie's memory while using the skills and knowledge she had gained during her ordeal. The West was changing rapidly, and it would need lawyers who understood both justice and mercy, who could bridge gaps between different communities and cultures. Dr. Harrison recovered from his unwitting involvement in Wade's schemes and became one of Clara's strongest allies in reforming Cedar Falls' civic institutions. His medical expertise, combined with traditional Comanche healing knowledge shared by Tana, helped establish a new model of healthcare that served all community members regardless of race or economic status. "Your mother will make a full recovery," Harrison assured Clara as they watched Margaret McKenzie regain strength with each passing day. "The poison is leaving her system, and her natural resilience is reasserting itself." Margaret McKenzie not only recovered, but thrived, becoming an advocate for other women who had suffered abuse or exploitation. Her experience with Wade's systematic poisoning gave her unique insights into how corruption could hide behind facades of respectability and charitable concern. Kicking Horse was elected as a peace chief by his band, representing them in negotiations with territorial authorities and helping to establish treaties that protected Comanche rights while promoting peaceful coexistence. His friendship with Clara had convinced both communities that cooperation was possible despite historical animosity. "You have become true warrior," Kicking Horse told Clara during their final meeting before she left for law school. "Not because you learned to fight, but because you learned when to fight and what to fight for." Tana presented Clara with a special gift, a necklace of turquoise and silver that would remind her of the lessons learned among the Comanche. "Wear this when you fight in white man's courts," the elder woman advised. "Remember that justice has many faces, but only one heart." Even Red Hawk, the war chief, who had initially opposed harboring Clara, eventually became one of her supporters after witnessing the positive changes her influence brought to relations between whites and Comanche. He served as a peace negotiator for decades, helping to establish treaties that protected his people's rights and traditions. Wade's trial became a sensation throughout the territory, drawing newspaper reporters and curiosity seekers eager to witness the downfall of such a prominent figure. Clara's testimony proved devastating to his defense. Her clear recollection of events supported by her father's meticulous documentation. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Wade was sentenced to hang for his crimes, but he cheated the gallows by dying in his cell from complications of the war hatchet wound alone, and abandoned by all his former allies. Morrison and Hawkins, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of following their employer to the grave, agreed to testify against other members of the conspiracy in exchange for prison sentences. Their revelations led to additional arrests and convictions, gradually dismantling the network of corruption that had strangled the territory for years. The silver deposits on the Mackenzie land provided the financial resources Clara needed to pursue her legal education. But she was careful to use the wealth responsibly. She established a fund to compensate families who had suffered under Wade's regime, contributed to the construction of a new courthouse built on principles of transparency and accountability, and supported efforts to establish fair trading relationships between white settlers and Native American tribes. 2 years after Wade's death, Clara opened her own law practice in Austin, specializing in cases involving land fraud and corporate corruption. Her first client was a group of Mexican-American farmers whose property had been stolen through forged documents, a case that reminded her powerfully of her own family's struggles. "Miss McKenzie," her client told her in broken English, "they say you understand what it means to fight powerful men who think they own everything." Clara smiled, touching the turquoise necklace that still hung around her neck as a reminder of the courage ordinary people could find when they stood together against injustice. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Gutierrez, and I know we can win if we're willing to fight for what's right." The Comanche turquoise caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through her office window, its polished surface reflecting the same blue-green depths she had seen in the Colorado River on that desperate night so long ago. But instead of terror, she now felt only determination and purpose. Clara McKenzie had found her calling, her mission, and her place in the world. The frightened seamstress who had been thrown into the river to drown had emerged as a warrior for justice, armed with law books instead of war hatchets. But no less dangerous to those who would exploit the innocent. 5 years later, when Clara married Dr. James Harrison, the young physician who had joined his father's practice and shared Clara's commitment to serving all people, regardless of their background, the wedding was attended by friends from across the cultural spectrum. Mexican-American farmers whose land she had saved, railroad workers whose rights she had defended, territorial officials whose corruption she had exposed, and even a delegation of Comanche led by Kicking Horse and Tana. The presence of Native Americans at a white wedding caused some controversy in Austin society, but Clara refused to exclude the people who had saved her life and taught her about courage. Their blessing meant more to her than the approval of narrow-minded neighbors who still viewed Indians as enemies rather than potential allies. Clara and James settled on the reclaimed family land near Cedar Falls, now a thriving community that had recovered from Wade's reign of terror. They built their home near the natural spring that had made the property so valuable, using the clear water to irrigate gardens and orchards that fed both their family and the broader community. Their first child, a daughter they named Evening Star, in honor of Kicking Horse's lost child, was born in 1878. The baby's arrival brought representatives from the Comanche band, who performed traditional blessings and presented gifts that celebrated the continuation of friendship between their peoples. "She will grow up knowing that courage comes in many forms," Clara told Tana as they watched the baby sleep peacefully in her cradle. "She'll learn about her grandfather's fight for justice and the kindness of the Comanche people who protected her family." Tana smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had lived to see her investment in the future bear fruit. Children need to know that good can triumph over evil, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose to stand together. When Clara was 35 years old, she received an invitation that brought her career full circle. The territorial governor asked her to serve on a commission investigating corporate corruption in land deals, specifically targeting the kind of fraud that had destroyed so many families during the railroad expansion years. The work was challenging and sometimes dangerous, as corporate interests fought back against efforts to expose their illegal activities. But Clara's reputation for thoroughness and integrity made her an effective advocate for families who had been cheated out of their rightful property. The commission's most significant case involved proving that the Eastern Syndicate that had employed Wade was still operating throughout the West using different local agents, but the same methods of intimidation and murder. Clara's investigation led to criminal indictments against dozens of corporate officials and government employees, along with the return of millions of acres to their rightful owners. But the victory that meant the most to Clara came in 1885, when she successfully argued a case before the Territorial Supreme Court that established permanent protections for Native American treaty rights. The decision cited her father's research and the precedents established during her own legal career, creating a foundation for justice that would endure long after she was gone. Kicking Horse, now an elderly but still vigorous chief, attended the court session where the decision was announced. Afterward, he approached Clara with the formal dignity that marked important moments in Comanche culture. "Your father would be proud beyond measure," he said simply. "You have kept faith with the promise you made as a young woman to stand for justice no matter the personal cost." Clara felt tears pricking her eyes as she remembered that desperate night by the Colorado River when a Comanche warrior had pulled her from the water and set her on the path to justice. "I couldn't have done any of this without the lessons you taught me about courage and community. Courage was always inside you." Kicking Horse replied with the wisdom of someone who had watched her grow from frightened refugee to accomplished advocate. "We simply helped you find it when you needed it most." The conversation was interrupted by Evening Star, now 7 years old, and already showing signs of the strong will that characterized the McKenzie women. She approached Kicking Horse with the easy confidence of a child who had been raised to see wisdom rather than difference in cultural diversity. "Uncle Kicking Horse," she said in fluent Comanche, "will you tell me again about the night you saved my mother from the river?" The old warrior's face creased into a smile as he settled down to tell the story that had become family legend. Clara listened with the same fascination she had felt as a child, hearing her father's tales of adventure and justice. Understanding that these narratives would help shape her daughter's character, just as Thomas Mackenzie's example had shaped her own. The story Evening Star heard that day was complete and satisfying, with every plot thread resolved and every character's fate clearly established. Wade had died in disgrace, his criminal network dismantled, and his victims compensated for their suffering. Morrison and Hawkins had served their prison sentences and disappeared into historical obscurity, their names remembered only as cautionary tales about the wages of corruption. Dr. Harrison had served as mayor of Cedar Falls for 15 years before retiring to pursue his medical practice, becoming known throughout the territory as a man who had helped his community heal from systematic oppression. Margaret McKenzie had lived to see her granddaughter born and had died peacefully in 1883, surrounded by family and secure in the knowledge that her husband's sacrifice had not been in vain. Tana had lived to see the successful negotiation of treaties that protected Comanche hunting grounds and cultural traditions, dying in 1884 as one of the most respected women in her band. Her funeral was attended by both Native Americans and whites, who had been touched by her wisdom and kindness. Lieutenant Morrison had gone on to a distinguished military career, rising to the rank of colonel, before retiring to become a territorial judge, known for his fairness and integrity. He often cited his experience with Clara McKenzie as the moment he learned to question authority and think for himself. As Clara listened to Kicking Horse tell their story to Evening Star, she felt a profound sense of completion and satisfaction. Every major character had found their proper resolution, every significant conflict had been resolved, and the themes of justice, courage, and community had been fully explored and validated. The turquoise bird that still hung around Clara's neck caught the afternoon sunlight, its polished surface reflecting the same depths that had nearly claimed her life so many years ago. The jewelry served as a tangible reminder of how far she had traveled from victim to victor, from the powerless to the powerful, from someone who feared injustice to someone who fought it professionally. "And they all lived happily ever after?" Evening Star asked as Kicking Horse concluded his tale, her young voice carrying the eternal hope of childhood. The old chief smiled, understanding the child's need for clear endings and moral resolution. "They lived with purpose and honor," he replied carefully. "And they left the world better than they found it, which is the truest measure of any life's value." Clara nodded her agreement, knowing that this was indeed the most important legacy anyone could leave. The scars from her ordeal with Wade had long since healed, replaced by the strength and wisdom that came from surviving adversity and choosing to help others facing similar challenges. As the sun set over the Texas landscape, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Clara of her dress on that long-ago night when everything had changed, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from a story fully told and a life purposefully lived. The river that had nearly claimed her life continued flowing toward the Gulf of Mexico, carrying the accumulated wisdom of countless stories toward the vast ocean, where all narratives eventually converged. Clara's story was complete, her father's legacy secured, and her daughter's future bright with possibility. In the gathering darkness, 3 generations of the McKenzie family sat together on the porch of their home, sharing stories and planning for tomorrow, while the stars emerged one by one overhead. It was an ending that honored both the struggles of the past and the hopes of the future. A conclusion that left no questions unanswered and no hearts unsatisfied. The turquoise bird around Clara's neck seemed to glow in the starlight, a permanent reminder that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit could soar free and find its way to justice. Clara McKenzie had kept her promise to her father, honored the friendship of those who had saved her life, and built a legacy that would protect countless families from the kind of corruption that had once threatened to destroy everything she held dear. The story was finished complete in every detail, satisfying in every resolution, and closed forever to further revision or addition. Under the star-scattered Texas sky, justice had triumphed. Love had conquered fear. And the next generation was ready to continue the work that defined not just the McKenzie family, but the very best aspirations of American democracy.